The Roman Empire, the greatest military power of the ancient world, expanded its reach across Europe, crushing countless enemies under its iron grip. But there was one land, wild and untamed, that Rome never truly conquered: Scotland. This is the forgotten war of the Roman invasion of Scotland, a brutal conflict fought on the edges of the known world. It all began with Julius Caesar's first expeditions into Britain in 55 and 54 BC. While these early campaigns established Rome's interest in the island, true conquest did not begin until almost a century later, in 43 AD under Emperor Claudius. The Roman legions marched into Britain, subduing its warlike Celtic tribes and establishing control over the southern regions. But Rome's hunger for expansion was insatiable. After decades of fierce battles, the empire's attention turned to the north, into the lands of modern-day Scotland. This would be a campaign unlike any other. Here, the Romans faced warriors who did not fight for riches or conquest, but for sheer survival. These were the ancestors of the fierce Highland clans, the Caledonians, masters of guerrilla warfare, experts in ambushes, and willing to fight to the last man. Rome's push into Scotland began under the command of Gnaeus Julius Agricola, a seasoned general appointed as governor of Britain in 77 AD. A man of ambition and tactical brilliance, Agricola had already earned his reputation by crushing rebellious British tribes and reconquering key territories. He had served in Britain before, gaining first-hand experience in the brutal nature of warfare against the island's native peoples. But his real test came in Scotland. The Romans had learned that controlling these northern lands would be no easy feat. The region was divided into fiercely independent tribes that had resisted every foreign invader before them. Agricola's first challenge was the Ordovices, a tribe that had wiped out a Roman cavalry unit in Wales. He responded with swift and merciless force, leading his legions into their strongholds and annihilating them in a matter of weeks. With the Ordovices crushed, Agricola turned his attention to the island of Mona, modern-day Anglesey. This had long been a stronghold of resistance, home to the Druids, who were seen as the spiritual leaders of Britain's defiance against Rome. In a bold move, Agricola sent his cavalry across the water, using their swimming-trained horses to launch a surprise attack. The island fell, and with it, the last major sanctuary of Rome's enemies in the south. With his rear secured, Agricola began his march into Scotland. His strategy was methodical. He built forts along the way, securing his supply lines and creating a network of defenses. Each step forward was calculated, ensuring that no ground was lost once taken. His legions carved their way into the highlands, facing bitter resistance from the Caledonian tribes. These warriors knew they couldn't defeat Rome in open battle. Instead, they harassed the legions with relentless ambushes, striking from the dense forests and disappearing into the mist. Their weapons were crude but effective: long slashing swords, spears, and small round shields that allowed for quick movement. The Romans, weighed down by their armor, found themselves struggling against an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. But Agricola was not easily deterred. He pushed forward, determined to bring Rome's order to this wild land. In 83 AD, after years of relentless campaigning, he finally forced the Caledonians into a decisive confrontation, the Battle of Mons Graupius. The Caledonian leader, Calgacus, had rallied an army of over 30,000 warriors. They gathered on the slopes of a vast battlefield, looking down at the disciplined Roman forces below. Agricola had around 20,000 men, but they were battle-hardened, highly trained, and equipped with superior weaponry. As the battle began, the Caledonians launched a ferocious charge, their war cries echoing through the valley. The Roman front lines held firm, using their disciplined formations to absorb the impact. Then, Agricola's cavalry swept around the flanks, encircling the enemy. The Caledonians fought savagely, but they were no match for Rome's tactical superiority. As the sun set, the battlefield was covered in bodies. Thousands of Caledonian warriors lay dead. It was a stunning victory for Rome, but the reality of the situation soon became clear. Scotland was a land too wild, too vast, and too fiercely independent to be tamed. The Caledonians, though defeated in battle, refused to submit. They retreated into the mountains, continuing their resistance through ambushes and raids. Despite his success, Agricola was recalled to Rome by Emperor Domitian, possibly out of jealousy or political maneuvering. Without his leadership, Rome's interest in Scotland began to wane. Maintaining control over the region proved too costly, and within a few decades, the legions began to withdraw. By the early 2nd century, Emperor Hadrian ordered the construction of a massive fortification to mark the empire's northern boundary, Hadrian's Wall. This was a clear admission that Scotland would never be fully conquered. Rome had faced countless enemies in its time: Carthage, the Germanic tribes, the Parthians. But the Caledonians had done something few others had achieved. They had resisted, endured, and ultimately outlasted the might of Rome. But the Romans weren't ready to give up completely. Even after Hadrian's Wall was built, Rome still harbored ambitions of pushing further north. In 142 AD, under Emperor Antoninus Pius, they launched another attempt to subdue Scotland. A new fortification, the Antonine Wall, was built 100 miles north of Hadrian's Wall, stretching from the Firth of Forth to the Firth of Clyde. This was Rome's second and final major push into the Caledonian heartland. For a brief period, it seemed like Rome might finally establish a permanent presence in Scotland. The Antonine Wall was shorter than Hadrian's but heavily fortified, manned by thousands of troops, and equipped with deep ditches, watchtowers, and military roads. The legions once again marched into the highlands, determined to impose order on the untamed land. But history would repeat itself. The Caledonians, refusing to submit, launched relentless raids on Roman forts and supply lines. The farther the legions advanced, the more vulnerable they became. The wild terrain and unpredictable weather played to the strengths of the local warriors, who struck under the cover of darkness and vanished before the Romans could respond. By 162 AD, just 20 years after its construction, the Antonine Wall was abandoned. The Romans retreated back to Hadrian's Wall, leaving Scotland in the hands of the fierce warriors who had resisted them for over a century. It was a humiliating admission of defeat. Despite Rome's military superiority, Scotland remained unconquerable. For the next 2 centuries, Rome maintained its presence in Britain, but its northern border remained in constant turmoil. Raids by the Caledonians and later the Picts, successors to the Caledonian tribes, kept the Roman legions on high alert. Rome launched occasional punitive expeditions into Scotland, but these were temporary and achieved little. By the early 5th century, the Roman Empire itself was in decline. Pressured by barbarian invasions, civil wars, and economic collapse, Rome could no longer afford to maintain its distant provinces. In 410 AD, Emperor Honorius officially withdrew all Roman forces from Britain, abandoning the island to its fate. Hadrian's Wall, once a symbol of Roman dominance, was left to crumble, and the great empire that had once seemed invincible faded from the land. But Scotland had never truly been part of that empire. It remained a land of warriors, a place that Rome, despite its might, could never fully subdue. The Caledonians had achieved something few had. They had faced the most powerful military force in history, and survived. Their descendants, the Picts and later the Scots, would go on to shape the history of Britain, forging a nation that would remain fiercely independent for centuries to come. In the end, the Roman war in Scotland was not just a story of battles and conquests, but of resilience, defiance, and the unbreakable spirit of a people who refused to be ruled. Scotland had resisted the greatest empire the world had ever known, and in doing so, it had written its own chapter in history, one that Rome would rather have forgotten.